was there any situation or any incident wherein in your project or in your product setup, you went something wrong or you did something wrong, something has gone wrong with the way you were working with your teams? What was that? And if yes, and what was that? And we want to just understand the problem a bit.
Okay. Well, as you remember, I'm not actually a Scrum Master. I'm a trainer, and a lot of times I travel to. So I do training on site. Now, when you ask about failure stories, you probably come to the right person because they've got failures by the bucket load. Many of that I've done myself, and I'd happily hold my hands up. And then others that other people have done.
With whatever lessons that you had in your training mishaps that you have had, right? So, what lessons or what things that you inculcate in your maybe teams that you work in, right? What is that thing that with your this failure kind of a thing that you ensure that they do not go wrong in their own say work, right? Be it a release or maybe in production support or whatever it could be.
I was with our internal systems, we did have a policy of when we're doing the scheduling. First, we've got to schedule 2 months out in advance, primarily because people want something and they tend to be blocked up for a while, but then the meetings start to taper down.
Making mistakes can only be done when you have a psychologically safe environment, when people are not going to point fingers at you. These lines are said by our guest for today, Dave Smith. In this episode, we unpack the crucial truth with Dave Smith, a leading voice in Agile world. Join us as we dissect the challenges of adapting Agile in an ever-changing landscape through his Agile failure stories as an Agile trainer, and discover how to navigate these pitfalls to achieve lasting success. So, without further ado, let's get started.
Hello, Dave. Welcome to the Agile Coaching Roundtables podcast. That is the podcast by Agile Coaching Roundtable. It's a great pleasure having you back on our show. Thank you so much for joining us today. And it would be a great conversation, I believe. Looking forward to our conversation today.
Oh, indeed. It's lovely to be back again. It's a lovely place to be.
Thank you so much. So, Dave, as we were just speaking offline, so this time we are trying to try something different with our podcast, and today we want to cover kind of a failure stories, and so that we learn from your failure stories and understand what did you learn, so that the audiences, the viewers and listeners would also learn from your story and maybe uh, try not to make those mistakes. So definitely looking forward to hear your failure story. And so to begin with, to just set the context, uh, we want to understand what was there any situation or any incident wherein in your project or in your product setup, you went something wrong or you did something wrong, something has gone wrong with the way you were working with your teams. What was that? And if yes, and what was that? And we want to just understand the problem a bit.
Okay. Well, as you remember, I'm not actually a Scrum Master. I'm a trainer, and a lot of times I travel to. So I do training on site. Now, when you ask about failure stories, you probably come to the right person because they've got failures by the bucket load. Many of that I've done myself, and I'd happily hold my hands up. And then others that other people have done. So I'll talk about one place I was sent to. Usually, as a trainer, when I'm sent on site, all I need is the details of where the site is and who to talk to first thing in the morning. That's fine. So I traveled 150 miles on a chilly February night. Had all information in sat nav, and I tend to drop up at the hotel, set all my clothes up for the next day, then drive it to the customer site just to get an idea of what the path is like. I've made the mistake before when I've left it until the next morning and I didn't anticipate it was a school run or something. So I've always driven the previous night and had a look around. There's a church on the right, there's a chippy on the corner, watch out, there could be kids around there. There's a bus stop that therefore it could be there could be stuck behind a bus or a coach, those kind of things. So sure enough, I did the recce that night, saw where it was. The next morning I went there with my page of details on my box of course materials. And that's another thing we've had an issue with. We used to courier course materials out in advance because people would take the train down, but unfortunately they would go astray somewhere. So I've been to one site when I show up and we can't find the course material. So I point out they were sent to this person. I was away this week, and then they were sent to him. He opened them and left them in his office, locked the office door, and went away for a week on holiday. So we couldn't get to them. And so as a result of that, I just said, look, if you're going to print the materials out, don't send them now, give them to me, I'll take them with me. So at least they're in my hands. So I show up with this box of materials on my arm and detail the contact, and I go to the reception and I tell them who I'm supposed to see, and the reception takes a look and then says, right, I can't find you. I said, okay, well, this is the person. So they contact the person, and then the receptionist actually turns to look to me and says, well, what are you here for? And that's when I started to get warning bells. I thought, don't you know, you paid for me to be here. Why are you asking what I'm here for? And I said, well, I'm here to run the course. And then she spoke a bit later on, and then I heard it echo, what do you mean there's no room? I thought, what? And then she said, hang on, somebody will be coming. So sure enough, my contact showed up. I'd never met him before, but he showed up, and he talked about, we've had to find a room for you. And it made it sound like this was my fault. And I thought, well, yeah, should I be grateful that you've actually fixed your mistake? I said, I don't know, but you've got to be professional in front of the client, haven't you? So we ended up getting put in an unheated barn. And this was chilly February. So people showed up in dribs and drabs, and I really want to get running with it because this was a 3-day course and there was an exam at the end, and time is actually quite tight. So you've got to finish by 4 o'clock. So 4 to 5 is exam on the last day. If you overrun, then either exam starts late, which you don't want happening, or the students miss some learning, which is going to affect exam chances. And at the end of the day, we're going to get judged on exam scores. We're going to get judged on passes, even though it's not the right way to do it. People will do that anyway. So we got into this unheated barn, and it had a space heater at the back. So we moved it forward and powered it on, but it was noisy. You turned it off so people could hear me, and it was freezing. So we then worked out, right, let's flick it on for 10 minutes to take a 10-minute break in the warm building. Come back in when it's been on full blast, turn it off, and then do 30 minutes of training. When it gets cold again, when people are shivering, then we'll jump out and put it back on again. So we did this alternation, flip forwards and backwards. Unfortunately, it meant we took a lot more breaks, and as a result, time was creeping on, so we had to go a bit quicker. Now, there was the exam at the end, and when I left, I didn't actually meet the contact, and they weren't there at all. Otherwise, I would have said to them, I hope it's warmer next time, or just make a comment about it. But when I got back to the office and they said, how did it go? I talked about the coldness, and how it was a bit disorganized, but I think I was being a bit defensive. What I was trying to say was, don't be surprised if the exam successes aren't particularly great here. You know, you're going to be trying to sit a 1-hour exam in a freezing room, and that isn't going to be good. But it turns out the scores weren't too bad. Okay, so luckily, so I thought, well, at least they got through. That's good. But I did recall to her, I hope it's going to be warmer next time, because I was due to be back down there in 3 weeks' time. So I showed up for the second date, and I got to reception, and of course they did the same thing. They looked, didn't see me there, said, yeah, they'll contact. Okay, ran my contact, and then said, what am I here for? And said, I'm here for the course. And then she said, we haven't got a course. So what do you mean? And she said, no, it's been cancelled. Okay, that's a bit strange. So I rang the office and said, well, it's been cancelled. And they said, well, we don't know about that cancellation. When? So the guy came along, and of course, time was clicking on. I should have started about 8:30, 9 o'clock. This was getting about 9:45. It wasn't good at all. And I was starting to panic a bit, thinking about how much time this is compressing. So he showed up and he said, yeah, the course has been cancelled. And we went back to his office, and he showed me an email, and the email actually said there are no resources available for cover on those dates. And I said, well, what do you mean it's been cancelled? Now, it turns out that statement actually meant the people I was teaching had to be released from their daily work, and there wasn't anybody that could cover their work. So that's what meant the course is cancelled. The phrase, no resources available for cover on those dates. And then I looked at the email. It was actually being sent internally. At no point did that actually get sent to our office. So they both agreed through this really strange business crone speak that they were going to cancel the course when nobody bothered to inform us. So there was a bit of a flurry of things going wrong. And in the end, I ended up bailing on that. I don't know what happened about it. But if you're thinking, but could we have spotted that issue earlier? Yes, we could have done it. At the end of the day, I can point the finger at the client and say it's all their fault, but I got red flags at the start that the organisation wasn't particularly good. So thinking about it, a week beforehand, I could have emailed the guy and said, "Hi, I'm coming back down again next week. I hope I don't get the same cold room as before." These sort of things to try and prompt them into hopefully thinking, "Oh crap, yeah, he is there, isn't he? He's coming again. We need to get that sorted." Or at least send something back to say, "No, don't you realise the course has been cancelled?" But there could have been that preempting, and I've kind of learned a bit about that now. I mean, the failure was really we didn't have sufficient checks and balances at our end. So we start to do some of those with, I've had situations where I've turned up to a room. Often when people book training, they say, yes, we want 10 people, want 15 people, but then they don't tell us who the people are. So they say, yeah, I'll book the course for 10 because it's always the same price. You show up and there's 3 people there, but you bought 10 PCs along with you. And what's happened is they only booked it for a small number of people. But there's been other situations where I've shown up, and usually in the first morning, I say, why are you here? What do you want to learn from the course? What do you know already? And sometimes I've shown up and said, well, what is it you want from the course? When you looked at the course outline, and the answer was, I don't know. We're only told about this yesterday. Well, hang on, but this was booked 2 months ago. Yes, and what's happened is the course booker has booked it, relaxed and forgot all about it, and then suddenly the date came up. So they then scurried around trying to find people. They haven't communicated it internally, and I get 4 people that actually want the course. The 2 people who do want it are away that day, and I get 3 janitors, 2 caretakers, and a guy they find sweeping the road outside just to attend to make up the numbers. So you tend to get exactly the wrong people on the course. But sometimes it is a bit about, or we address that point by saying, how many are coming, and can we have the names and email addresses beforehand? Okay, so then we either get the names there and then, or we get them at least a week before the course. But before the course, if they're not coming through, it tells us that they haven't really got themselves sorted. Now, I don't mind if the list has 10 people on there. I show up and there's only 8 people. 3 people are about to drop out and 1 person's joined. That's fine. I've got enough kit for 10. That's good. We can just run with it. But I have been to one place where they say 10, the names will be forthcoming. You'll be getting the names later, and the names never come. And I show up and there's 13 people. And it's because they expected some people to drop out. So they overspected and nobody dropped out. So they had 30, which was fine, except I bought 10 sets of course materials with me. So some people had to share, and they complained about, well, there's not enough materials to go around. And the answer was, well, yeah, I mean, basically I've got a plane of 10 and you've gone and sold 13 tickets. So don't be surprised if somebody's sitting on another person's lap. We can't be held to blame for that, but we're going to get judged by it. No, that's our event, and we shouldn't need to be judged by it. So we start to impose more controls over that. So one of them is about looking back at the red flags and the warning signs. But there's been a few situations where I can easily hold my hand up and say there's been a problem.
What I thought, maybe this is my understanding, or this is my of looking at the information or the experience that you shared. Again, is like the information was already handed to you, that was available with you. Maybe I believe for you the intention was, or you pre-assume that I know the place, I'm aware about where I need to reach at, but maybe you did not take a look of what was handed over to you at the first place, right?
Yes, I mean that was definitely on me. I've got to say that, but it's a customer that I've been to 3 or 4 times. So this was the 5th visit, and I just looked at the customer name and I didn't even bother looking at the address. Having said that, when I said I looked at the customer name, I didn't even look at the second line that talked about a different office name. I just didn't see that, and that was just arrogant on my part.
Yeah.
Now, I have had other situations where something went wrong as a result of insufficient checks. And the first question I do ask is, what could I have done to have prevented that? And the one thing I do like is that the team I worked with, when something went wrong and I went up and talked about what went wrong, there was always this thought of what can we do different to change that. So we then implemented we need to have the list of people when you book the course. Then actually it doesn't need to be when you book the course, but it needs to be within a week. And we need to have something in a form where it's going to be filled in, but if that's still empty and we're still T minus 10 days, then somebody gets an email, somebody gets alert. So we set up these kind of checks and balances. Now, something I learned about the location. because of that, and I had to keep putting the location in, our booking system, our training system, when people book onto a course, when we specified where it was, I actually made a change so that we could put a Google Maps link in there. So when people get the email to say this is where you're going, they can click on that and it can show you exactly where the building is. They can then favorite that or just say, how do I get there? So we're not giving them the name of something and they've got to try and find it and then find the wrong one. You've actually got the exact spot it's taken place, provided I've got it right. But it did reduce a lot of problems when some people said they couldn't find the place. And at the end of it, if you're sending information out to 15 people and 15 people have got to do a search for it, why don't you search it once and then put the results in there? You know, why should all these people have a go at that? So we start to think about what are the different ways in which things could go wrong from the client end. How can we improve things on the supplier end? Now, that certainly improved things like team morale. But I think as a trainer, when people say, well, you've got a lot of experience in all of these. Now, I've just been around a great many companies and seen a lot of similarities between them. And success and failure go hand in hand. I don't think the path to success is a completely true straight path. Nobody who's ever successful has never failed.
Yes. Absolutely true. So maybe Ramya, do you want to take it?
Sorry,
Yes. Yeah. So he just asking me to just take up the next one. So maybe Dave, what we understand from this is obviously now whenever you go for any training assignments, right, or maybe training projects, you would be super cautious from your end to ensure. I mean, you would have your own checklist to see that okay, whether this is done or this is done, this is done. I clearly remember when I talked to you. I mean, when we talked for the first time regarding this podcast, not this one, the earlier one. I remember you were so specific that okay, would you like to send the invite? Would you like to block my time because I want to be so sure that I don't miss the date. And now I get why you were saying this. I'm pretty sure that when it comes to you in terms of working in as say agile trainer or maybe agile coach or even scrum master in whatever capacity that you work, I'm really I mean I'm pretty sure that you would be inculcating this discipline and this ways of working with your teams as well, right? I mean, what I believe is as coaches or as trainers or as even scrum masters, we try to kind of inculcate the part of ourselves which we know that it worked best for us, or maybe we know that okay, we don't want to mess it up because of our previous experiences even to the teams, right? So maybe with whatever lessons that you had in your training mishaps that you have had, right? So what lessons or what things that you inculcate in your maybe teams that you work in, right? It could be like agile teams or scrum teams or even in the trainees, right? So what is that thing that with your this failure kind of a thing that you ensure that they do not go wrong in their own say work, right? Be it a release or maybe in production support or whatever it could be.
I was with our internal systems, we did have a policy of when we're doing the scheduling. First, we've got to schedule 2 months out in advance, primarily because people want something and they tend to be blocked up for a while, but then the meetings start to taper down. So I think if all of these meetings are there, they can actually book them. You think about booking flights or booking hotels or so. Many of the flights are actually booked up or available, months or so in advance. You can book one for Christmas or Easter next year. So they've all been pre-arranged. So we try and do things 2 or 3 months out so that people can book. And if people aren't available for the one that's coming up next week, then there is going to be one a month later. When we sort out the schedule, I learned that some people, if there's an advanced course and a basics course, they'll try and skip the basics and go straight on the advanced. So we actually did it the other way around. So we've done it chronologically so that the courses later on in the month are actually the more difficult ones to the earlier ones, and the earlier ones are prerequisite. So there's no real reason why you couldn't have attended those. So the actual design of that is important to ensure that we don't get people trying to run when they can't walk. Similarly, when we set up the schedule, we had a policy that I would set it up and one person would test it. And if they were happy with it, after checking it, they would release it, or the other way around. They would formulated, I would run through and check and look at the dates and other things. If I was happy, I'd then release it. So I thought having 2 sets of eyes would always be a good idea. Also, when the schedule is released and all the courses are available online, the first person who books onto a course is me. I sign myself up, I get the email. I then add the Google link, the Meet link, or the invite, the calendar invite, into my own diary, and I want to see it showing up on the same dates as I've actually got planned, so I know all the information is in there. Now, I think this comes from a testing thing of you've got to, as a waitress, you've got to eat your own meals. You've got to actually go to your own restaurant and just see what's going on. You've got to be subject to your own process. I think they say majority of HR departments or directors should actually try applying for their own job and just see how bad the process is. So you've got to get that viewpoint from there. So I do that to understand what our clients or students are seeing. Now, so what I've also learned from all of this about pitfalls and so, number one, don't presume that people are infallible. You know, everyone makes mistakes. That's the purpose of us being human. That's why I like process automation, because it does remove a lot of those mistakes. But it's only reducing it if things are repeatable. So if everything happens time after time after time, great. It's turning the wheel, the systems can do it for you. If it's something that's an exception to that, as soon as you put the human exception in there and you start tweaking things, you're then going to introduce the element of variance. I mean, Ramli, you'll see this as being, that's basic risk management. We all know about that. Yeah, it is. But you've got to understand that these things can happen. Okay. Now, I've always felt because people are not always organized, you should plan things as though they had nothing to do with it. So you try and take ownership as much as possible. Sometimes it does make me out to be a bit of a control freak. And I got that from my father, who didn't kind of trust a lot of people doing things. So he always had to do things himself. But I've gone the other way, where I've relaxed and let people do things, but I'll just follow up to find out if things have
Wow.
been done. Yeah, it probably explains a great deal, doesn't it? But he's ex-forces, he's ex-military, so he always wanted these things planned in advance. I was a bit more relaxed, but I always think, don't presume that they haven't forgotten. So you always check beforehand. So occasionally I keep chasing people up to say, you mentioned this thing last week. Has that been done yet or not? I mean, have I missed out on something? And you don't try and point the finger at them. You just say, I might have missed out on the email that went around. Has that happened yet? Oh, right, it's coming at the end of the week. Okay, we'll do it at the end of the week. Okay, so number one, don't presume people are infallible. Number two, try and preempt problems. Try and do the risk management idea, or what if. So what could possibly go wrong? Now, although the first time I did an on-site training course, I had all my clothes laid out on the bed before I packed them. I had 3 maps printed out. I used to use MapQuest because we didn't have sat-nav back then. I know it's going back a bit. And I had a map of the hotel, a map of the customer site, then a map showing both of them close together, showing the route I had to take, and then one showing the motorway where I needed to get to. So basically, I used the last map to get me to where the second map should kind of guide me, and the first map to show me how close the hotel was. So if I went around for a stroll, so I had these 4 printouts for each course. So I did all of those to make sure I didn't get lost. I used to try and use Google Maps also to actually find out how long it's going to take, make sure I leave them plenty of time. I had everything packed, everything sorted. I had spare cables, so on and so forth. And then as time progressed, I actually got more and more slack, more relaxed about it. And I realized all I needed was decent clothes, presentable clothes to wear. And I needed the details of where the customer site was. And I needed my laptop from time to time, and that was it. Anything else I could borrow there. So I've got there and found I missed my washing kit, or I haven't got a tie. I've just gone out and bought one. And there's been a case where I traveled abroad and they lost my suitcase. So I was missing my clothes, but luckily I had a company T-shirt in my bag. So I showed up the next day wearing the company T-shirt and the rest of my other clothes that I'd been in. But that was enough to actually present a kind of professional face until my suitcase showed up at the customer's site a few hours later. And I quickly got changed and got cleaned up and then came back with something a bit smarter. Okay, but the customer was told that I was late as a result of the planes being cancelled and bad weather, and one of my colleagues managed to jump online and do some virtual stuff and start it and get it started. So when I walked in a couple of hours later, he'd already got them into the first bit, so there wasn't that much of an impact. But as well as the preempting problems, you do have to think about what are the redundancy measures you can do. Can you actually let somebody know you're late and have somebody step in? What kind of these things do? So now I've also found, just not so much in a matter of you creating mistakes or other people creating mistakes. Sometimes you're completely outside of that. But if you heard about the mistake, step in and offer to fix things. When they say, well, people, the problem is not really process or product, it's always people. People are always a problem, therefore people are a solution. But sometimes the people who created a problem aren't necessarily around to be the solution. And just because you are the solution doesn't necessarily mean you've created the problem. So I'm forever hearing of problems or issues or challenges that come up. And I think, well, I could help out with this. It's not your fault. You didn't create this. Yeah, I know it isn't, but I think I know how to fix it. So I often step up and volunteer and try and meet people halfway, try and be flexible about it, because it could mean I know how to fix something in 10 minutes, but it's going to take another person 2 hours. Why not just step in and give them a hand with that? Now, also, when I do fix things, I offer to show the person what the fix is. I recall a Japanese proverb that says, a stupid man breaks something and tells nobody. An intelligent man breaks something and tells somebody. A wise man breaks something and tells everybody. And the idea is everybody learns
Wow.
from that person's mistake. When we say wise man, we should say wise person, really. But okay, it's
Yeah.
an old proverb. But it is about the stupid person fears for their ego, and it will be found out, but it gives them time to get away from there. The intelligent person, when they break something, they go looking for somebody who can fix it. They can't fix it, but they know it's broken. They own up to it, and therefore it gets fixed. But the wise person says, let's not just get it fixed, but let's let everyone else learn from my mistake. So I've always made a point of doing that. So, I mean, this morning somebody said, we need to try and get this thing that isn't working. Do you know what it is? And I think I do. I think it's over here and over there. Have a look at this. And he came and said, yeah, I've got it done. But I said, if you're stuck, we'll just hop into a virtual session. We'll have a look around and click around, and I'll suggest a few things because I think I know this tool okay. I don't know where it is to fix, but let's search for it together and let's learn together. Okay. Now, so based on the second point I mentioned about preempting problems, I do like to prepare up front. As I said, I'm a bit fastidious about trying to get things done early. I hate it when things are done and left to the last minute. I mean, when people talk about pressure, and so often pressure is caused by bad communication. Something needs to be done, but nobody mentions it until the last moment. And then suddenly you had 2 weeks to do something, but you left it until the last 4 hours of the day, and you're suddenly going to rush. So if I'm informed about it early, then that's something I can do about it. And I remember a project manager actually, there was a number of speakers at a project management conference, and they were all asked, give us a word or a sentence or something, some piece of advice that you would give to other project managers. And one of them said, bring me bad news early. He said, don't sit on it.
Wow.
Okay, if you sit on it and I find out too late, I'll rip you a new one. You bring it early, we've got plenty of time to actually deal with it. Now that engineered a culture of people weren't going to get blamed for their mistakes. Okay, they're going to be transparent about it. And I took a message from that when I did some peer reviews of some code bases. I made sure that mine was the first one that was reviewed, and I made sure I left some problems in the code. So people could point them out and laugh and point at them. And then when other people had exactly the same code problems, it was, yeah, he's just on a bit like Dave, isn't he? Move on. We already know that. And people then wouldn't be victimized. So I was quite happy. I was thick-skinned enough to take all of the punishment. But I think if you show that you are fallible and you are vulnerable, and somebody who as great as you can still make these damn mistakes, then maybe it can't be that bad. Okay. And I think also if you demonstrate, yeah, it was my mistake, but I'm not frightened by it. I'm not going to shrug it off. I'm actually going to say, I'm going to learn by that and do something about it. Other people think, well, maybe that's where we should be. Maybe we shouldn't hide them. But making mistakes can only be done if you've got a psychologically safe environment. If people are not going to point fingers and scream and shout, and that
Absolutely.
only happens when you've got egos and you've got toxicity, you've got superheroes, you've got rock stars, that kind of places. A lot of the places I work in, many people are open and humble. It's the humility I love about the place. So I'm perfectly happy to actually put my hand up and say, yeah, that was my cock up. I was the one that did that. Okay, here's what I did. If you don't want to do it again, don't be a Dave. Okay, avoid that. So those are my tales.
Yes. While you were speaking, mentioning that maybe giving utmost trust to people, right? Uh, just wanted to check. I mean, has there been a case where the it has backfired when the trust has been put on to the people involved, and maybe giving them the thing that we say, giving them the utmost autonomy, but somehow eventually by the end of the day, what we had anticipated or what we had thought about, maybe it turned exactly opposite to that, and maybe the maybe as we say, like, giving them the entire freedom to do the things as they wish, right? Has that been a case ever in your case?
Yes, it has. When I was first empowered to do something when I worked in systems, I was then in a bit of a quandary because I was always used to doing certain things. And when I handed that job over to somebody else and I stepped to do something else, I had to, number one, learn what the new work was, and then number two, learn to let go of the existing stuff. And I wasn't very good at number two. I think part of it was not trusting that the team would be doing it right and they needed my supervision. So I was always frequently checking up, and I became the micromanager that I hated in people. And at some point, I thought, no, I just got to let them go. I've got to let them make their own mistakes. And of course, they make the mistakes and they learn from them, but they learn pretty well from them. And similarly, in another job, the person who was given, who I delegated work to or entrusted to do something, didn't do it well. But I didn't tear a strip out of them. It basically was, yeah, these things weren't done right. So next time you do it, what do you do differently? And it was all about learning from your mistakes. And I made a point of saying, like, I did the same thing like that before as well. Actually, I did it worse. Actually, got completely the wrong dates and ended up with a course that's 3.5 years long, not 3.5 days, just because I didn't notice the dates. So you've got to allow people to make mistakes. I remember my old man saying, management is the way of making mistakes safely. He said, you will make mistakes, but you've got to own them. You've got to own up to them because you're still finding your way around things. But I know some management courses I went on and also used to run as well. There was a lot of people that were first in management, and it came across those 2 points I mentioned, that they weren't just learning to find their feet, they're also learning to let go. And if you don't learn to let go, if you don't learn to actually become to have leadership in what you do and learn to delegate things down and just trust people will get on and do it, but not rip them on when they make a mistake, encourage them to try and try again. Because every manager, if they reflect on their own abilities or their own past, how many of them can actually say they've been perfect
Correct.
managers when they first started?
Correct. Yeah. And I mean, just to cut you over here, Dave. So when you talked about maybe giving the bad news or making the mistakes and owning up the mistakes, right? So I'm just trying to put this in the context of the work that we do, right? I mean, we kind of coach teams, right? On bringing the best or efficient ways of working, right? For an example, and imagine that if they were to come across a manager who is very obnoxious, right? And something has gone maybe wrong in the production, something has broken up in the production, just an example. And now they know that if they own this mistake, this manager is going to beat them up, saying that no, you have made mistake, how it could go wrong, and so on and so forth, right?
Mhm.
And also you mentioned about that people make mistakes and they own it when we provide that psychological safety, right? So if there is no psychological safety in the teams, definitely team members are not going to own those mistakes and they're going to just kind of hide behind other people, saying that no, if I open up my mouth over here and if I kind of confess my mistakes, I'm going to be blamed and beaten up by my managers, right? So I mean, how do we deal with such situations, or maybe how do we empower such managers to kind of provide that psychological safety? Because lot of things have been talked and said, you know what, we need to do this psychological safety, provide such psychological safety to teams. But then, as you rightly mentioned, not everyone comes up with that amount of trust, or maybe trusting team members, or maybe provide that leeway for the team members to fail and maybe learn from their mistakes, right? So how does that happen? I mean, does it happen only when one fails as a manager or as a leader? Only then they inculcate this, or it comes naturally, or it comes with lot of maybe conditioning or breaking the box or maybe learning? How does that happen?
Right. Psychological safety to me is like walking around a developed country that's civilized, where there aren't any dangers around, and you can just stroll around, t-shirt and jeans, pushing a pram, everything's perfectly fine. Places that are toxic could actually be war-torn areas. It's not safe to walk around, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's completely devoid of people. The people that walk around there are people that know it's dangerous, but are able to cope with the danger. So if you've got a team or a situation where there isn't any psychological safety, there's toxicity, it isn't so much about trying to create psychological safety, but trying to harden the people to the attitudes of those where they can survive despite psychological safety. So if I have a manager who likes to tear a strip into people for doing something wrong, the first question would actually be is how do I stand up to them? So when they point the finger and say you're an idiot, then the answer is yes, I am. Do you want to get someone else to do the job instead then? Or maybe, yeah, you're the idiot for trusting me and thinking I wouldn't do it by mistake, right? Well, when you do it next time, do it right. Well, actually, no, mate. I'm not going to guarantee I'm going to do it right next time, and I may make a mistake again. But the question is, do you want to keep giving me the job to do? And eventually, I'm going to do it so often that it's going to be impossible for me to do it without a mistake. And it's that business about you don't practice until you get something right. You actually practice until you can't get it wrong, until it becomes natural. And the only people that are going to do that are people who are soft in an environmental safety, a psychological safe position where they're allowed to fail, or people that are actually quite tough and then inert that can deflect the attacks to them when they do fail. Now, I did develop a bit of the thick skin for the second part, where I did just realize that no matter what I do, this person ain't going to be happy. So it's pointless me trying to make them happy. So when they came up with snide remarks and other things about it, I just nodded and went, yep, fine. Okay, and just let it wash off. And what I soon realized was that I had a job to do. I had clients, I had customers I wanted to please, and I was going to do with it despite that individual. And now, finally, as far as I'm concerned, they may have actually taken all the credit for it and say, oh, yeah, thanks to my expert leadership and management, that's why we've got happy customers. But the customers remembered me. They didn't remember this individual. And one workmate, when I was in a meeting, I was in a meeting with a work colleague, and we talked about and discussed ways of doing things. And we built up a diagram, I think it's still got it on the wall, actually, a diagram of how a process would actually work. And we designed the system based on his input. Then this line manager came in and then started telling me what the system was going to be. Didn't even see the diagram on the board, started dictating to us how it was going to go. Completely missed a number of things that we'd considered. So I just nodded and agreed. And I said, yeah, not a bad idea. Okay. And then they discussed about starting a project and getting developers and other people involved, when in fact me and this other person that I'd been talking about how we were going to build it ourselves. It wasn't something over complex. So the line manager made out to be quite a big thing. It would involve a number of people and other stuff. I thought, yeah, fine. They then got called away from the room. They had something more important to do than the people they were managing. That's all right. We're fine. We're just resources. We're not actual people. But then he turned to me and said, how do you work with somebody like that? And I said, well, there's the trick. I don't. I work for her, but I'm not really working with her. And I just agree and just let her think that she is running the show. But my end objective was, I don't really care what she said or did. I just wanted that thing to be in place. And if it meant going along with her, kowtowing her, yeah, perfectly fine. And I understood also that many times I just didn't involve her in communications and decisions. I went to the key people. I found that when I was taking things to her, I say her, it wasn't actually, but when I took them to that person, they'd often be questioned to death. And the answer was, well, actually, I don't know. I want to discuss it with that person. But no, everything needed to be upfront and cleared before you even approach some other individual, or the idea would be shut down because it wasn't feasible, or that team wouldn't like that. I found when I bypassed that person, and I went directly to that team or department and talked to them about it, we got on great when we bounced ideas around. And I thought, okay, this is somebody who's actually being a blocker, an impediment to progress. And in fact, they're not facilitating it, they're blocking it. So I've actually got justification to not take things to them. I did a bit of a spin to say I didn't want to bother them about these things that should be trivial to them because they had more important things to do. But at the end of it, they weren't that good at what they did. I bypassed them. Things worked. So it created the culture that they had everything's working perfectly fine thanks to their leadership. And when they left a bit later, I don't think anybody actually said, well, everything's going to crumble. They kind of realized that this person was a bit surplus to requirements. So as a result, everything will be working quite functionally. And I think maybe that's because of the relationships and other people I'd worked with. But sometimes it is about seeing the barrier, seeing the border, but trying to find out a way around it. Okay, not remove the blockage, but if the blockage is there and it cannot be moved, then you've got to walk around somehow. So you get a manager who likes to tear a strip from you. You've got to let it wash off. I think also I've done some jobs in service desk support where you'll get an annoyed customer ringing you up and tearing a strip out of you because you were the person who actually built this faulty process, this faulty item, and you were the one who made sure it failed at exactly the most inconvenient time for that person on the end of the phone. That's why you were blamed. And I knew at the end of the day, they were ranting about it and raving about it, and they were blaming you because you're in the firing line. Something I learned in service desk management was you've got a customer who rings, they're on the then there's a problem there, and you're on the other side, so they're actually looking straight ahead, and they see the problem, and they see you, and they're blaming you. What you've got to do is walk around the side of the problem, come round to them, and both looking and say, yes, well, it is a problem, isn't it? We need to get this fixed. So you start to empathize with them that way, and it is about putting yourself in their shoes. So when people ring and say, well, I'm late for the following, oh, we can't have that. That's not good. Okay, can we get a spare car out to you? Can we do the following? What is it you need? What can we help you with now? And it's turning the problem into solution focusing, into what can we do now to fix it. And I think when you've got that mentality, you start seeing how do we get these things fixed? And that should be the attitude to all failures. What do we do about it? That's the big learning experience.
Yeah. Okay. So maybe obviously you have shared great insights about the takeaways or maybe the learnings that one should be taking out. But maybe if had it been the same situation again, would you have followed the same approach, or would you have maybe thought of taking a different approach, right? So maybe what I'm trying to put across is like, if you want to reassess a situation, what would be the the thing that you would like to share with our listeners, maybe from a different approach, if you want to take it that way?
Oh, that's actually a very good question, because I have had situations where, and again, I made a huge mistake on this one. A client had a certain need, a certain problem. I recognized the problem, or I thought I recognized it as the one I'd solved before. Therefore, I proposed the ideal solution, and the solution was wrong. But I was fixated on plowing ahead with that solution. It turns out it wasn't the right one, and it didn't advance them whatsoever. And at the end of it, I said, yeah, really, that's been expensive cock up, and it's been my mistake. What I didn't do is actually listen too deeply to the problem. So I think, again, this is a problem with user stories or project requirements, is that we do what we think is needed, not what's actually needed. And unless we keep checking back to the person who's the recipient, the requester, and just verify that we are on the right track, we end up deviating off, and we've just gone miles before we realize we're actually in the wrong direction. So I've had scenarios where I've tried to repeat the same thing, thinking it's a tried and tested solution, but I've always kept an eye out for what happens if it doesn't. Now, I've also learned that I shouldn't tell them this is what we should do. And this is something I think Dolly Parton said, is that she doesn't tell people what the solutions are. She just tells people what solutions she's done to solve a problem. And now I started to do that. I started to dress it up as being, well, this is what I did with these. So when a client says, I've got this problem with this particular team member, they won't do the following. My response is often, I've heard of another group where they had something similar. This is the problem they had, and this is what they did as a solution. Okay, and then just leave it at that. And I want them to actually take inspiration from it and get them to understand this could be a potential way forward. It may not, but what I'm not telling them to do is you must do this. I'm saying this is what they did. So I try and dress it up that way. But if it's something I'm implementing myself, I'm always checking, because of that cock up, I'm always checking now to make sure that have I become fixated? Have I got target blindness because I'm obsessed about this must be the way forwards? And I'm looking carefully to see if there's any red flags that show up that tell me actually I could be in the wrong path.
Nice. That's a good way to look at it. Now it's like now you are every time watching your steps before you take, so that I mean you are like cautious, at least from your end. Obviously, you cannot control everything and every situation, right? So at least whatever you can, maybe you are trying to be cautious and watching your steps so that you don't make or repeat the mistakes, right? So maybe the last question I want to ask you for today is, if you were to give maybe few key takeaways for our audiences or the listeners or viewers to avoid similar pitfalls in their own agile journeys, because most of our audiences or maybe followers are on the agile space, right? So whatever stories that you have shared, I mean, we asked for one, you had like so many stories, and it's so great to listen to that. And the whole point of doing this kind of a podcast is that, like a wise man or a wise person, you share your failures so that others can learn from your failures, right? So few key takeaways, even if it is one key takeaway, that is fine, but then any key takeaway that you have for our audiences in their journey so that they don't make such mistakes.
Okay, so some key sentences to recall. Number one, you don't test the depth of the water with both feet. Okay, because you've got to make sure you're on safe ground. I remember that from rock climbing, when you only climb a certain amount of way before you put protection in, because you always fall twice the distance from your last protection. So the longer you leave it, the more you've gone off. And it's kind of, let's not project manage it, let's scrum it, let's go iterative incremental. Okay. Number two, I will recount something I recall when I was learning to drive. Somebody said to me, the road is trying to kill you. It looks like a lovely clear road one day, and you drive the same road, and then one day there's a patch of ice and you slip off, but you get overconfident and the road bends around a corner and you keep going around that corner at 30, but then one day there's a car on the other side, or there's a horse. Okay, so you get lulled into a false security that everything is fine, but you've got to be prepared for these things happening. So I think number 2 point is, if we talk about you don't test the depth of the water with both feet, whenever you cross the stream on the stepping stones, do not presume that stepping stone will always be solid. It was solid yesterday, it may not be today. Okay, so you've got to, when you step forward, if it starts rocking, don't be surprised and don't put all your weight on there. Don't step on presuming it to be there. Okay, so don't presume people haven't forgotten. Try and preempt these problems. Number 3 is, when something goes wrong, how would you advise yourself? What kind of love letter would you write to yourself and send back in time? Okay, so it's all about analysing what went wrong and what would you do differently and learn from that mistake. So I think I've said before, it's failure is always a good teacher. Nobody ever learns anything by getting it wrong the first time. So by getting it right the first time, you always make these mistakes. But how do you act on them, and how do you actually describe it to anyone else? And I'm mindful of a colleague that actually said, when you solve a problem, solve it again, because unless you solve it a second time, the first time when you do the solution, you think that's the only solution. When you do the second one, then you've got something to compare against. And I thought that's an interesting point, actually, because a lot of times when I create something, I often go back and think, well, how could I do this differently? How could I change this framework? How could I change that API call? What could I do differently? Essentially, I'm going back and refactoring it. I'm just rewriting the code. But it does make me think about, if I was going to do this by a different method, how would I do it? And it gives you a comparison. And John Cleese gave a good talk about innovation when he said some of the best ideas were rewritten, not written. It's when you rewrite them and you've got the spirit, the ethos of something, because you've lost the first one, and you find the second one is measurably better. And I realized then, it's when you've succeeded, you've done it, but you've done it only once. Unless you do it a second or third time, you really don't know how good that once approach is. So yes, you've got a failure, you come up with an idea of how to fix it, you try and implement several different ways of doing it, or you look back and think, what were the different ways in which I could have prevented that failure, or how should I have done it differently? And that is something I often do. I often reflect on things I've done. I wish I'd have been there a bit earlier, wish I'd have done that on that last day. You can keep beating yourself up by mistakes, but it gives me some kind of thought process as to, if I was going to do things differently, what should I do? And then I've always got that kind of branching framework in my mind when I approach situations, and I think, what the different things I could do to get me to the next step. And from there, when I'm on the next step, what the things I could do now to get me to the step after that. So I don't always look at the end point. I think, well, what do I get to the next and the next, and just treat it as being divide and conquer. Get to the next step, get to the next step. That's how you solve things.
Wow, amazing points. I mean, even without mentioning agile, you have covered like so many points that we actually do in agile, right? Be it maybe your manager saying that break the bad news first. That means fail fast, right? And learn from your failures, learn from the mistakes. We also say that inspect and adapt in Agile, and you said that you introspect what you have done, and we can beat for our mistakes, but then what you learn from it, and do not assume things. That is also another thing that we say. And also, you mentioned that you don't have to look at the destination, but then you look at the journey, right? Again, we say agile is a journey and it's not a destination. Without naming it an agile, but then you have said all things of agile, and I am so happy that these are the things even from your personal life or professional life. These things, all of these things, we try to apply in our own work as well, right? I mean, when we talk about agile, it's so refreshing to learn something new and from a different perspective. Though we know all these things, but then when we try to reflect back all of these to our personal life, is when we realize that we were always doing these things, but then we were never kind of putting a finger saying that, okay, this is what we are doing or implementing in a professional life as well, right? So thank you so much, Dave, for coming over and doing this podcast with us yet again. We thoroughly enjoyed this, and I hope our audiences finds value in this, and I'm sure people would be wanting to watch you and listen to you, because it's like we look forward to your comments, your posts. I mean, I know that you post very little, but then you comment. I mean, whatever you share, right? Those are like golden nuggets of wisdom, that I would say. So thank you so much for spreading your knowledge to all of us, and coming over once again and doing this podcast with us. It was great talking to you.
It's lovely to have been here.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
Dave.
you two.
Thank you so much for watching this episode patiently till the end. We hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll meet you again in the next episode. Till then, if you like our podcast show, then do like, share, subscribe, and let us know your feedback in the comment section. You can also listen to the episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, and Audible. Thank you.